Leading our discussion today is Hella Dale, our Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. She focuses on the U.S. government's institutions and programs for strategic outreach to the public of foreign countries, has a widely read foreign affairs column that she has authored since 1995. She also serves as a media fellow at the Hoover Institution and a member on the Council of Foreign Relations, and serves on the Board of Visitors for the Institute on Political Journalism at Georgetown, as well as the board of the Center for Free Inquiry at Hanover College. Please join me in welcoming Hella Dale. Hella?
Thank you, John. And thank you to our speakers for being with us today, and to all of you for joining us. Looking at Europe today is especially timely given the recent turmoil and upheaval in the world financial markets. And this serves as a reminder to us all that if policymakers desire to have strong stock markets, they should implement policies that preserve economic freedom and foster an environment where the private sector can grow without the constant interference of regulations, paperwork, and bureaucrats. According to the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, which I hope you had a chance to pick up outside in the foyer, most European economies, unfortunately, still suffer from some of these problems: high labor costs, tax burdens, mounting debt, and government regulations. We have recently seen some new problems emerge: the Greek debt crisis and the unprecedented migration from the Middle East that have added to the economic turmoil on the continent. Today we have three eminent speakers to help us sort through these issues. Our first speaker will be Desmond Lachman, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He joined AEI after serving as managing director and chief emerging market economic strategist at Solomon Smith Barney, and also previously served as deputy director in the International Monetary Fund's Policy Development and Review Department. And he was also active in staff formulation of IMF policies. Our second speaker will be Anders Aslund, who is a I think I'm gonna get my senior fellow at the Atlantic Council at the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center, and he has a wealth of experience, both diplomatic and academic, on issues related to the economies particularly of Europe's East. He has written numerous books, the most recent one being Ukraine: What Went Wrong and How to Fix It. And he has been associated with numerous distinguished institutions, from the Stockholm School of Economics to the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies, the Peterson Institute of International Economics, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Carnegie Endowment. And our final speaker today will be Ted Brummond, our own Ted Brummond here at the Heritage Foundation, who is, I'm sorry, my paper's got out of order here, but Ted is the Senior Research Fellow in Anglo-American Relations at the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom of the Heritage Foundation. Ted joined Heritage in 2008, and prior to that, he served for 9 years as Associate Director of Yale University's International Security Studies, a center dedicated to study and teaching of diplomatic history and grand strategy. He was also a lecturer in history, and from 2004 in the International Affairs program, a Master of Arts program at Yale. So we will proceed without further ado. After our speakers have a chance for 10 or 15 minutes to say their piece, we will have time for Q&A, and there should be some sandwiches in the hall outside when the program is over. So thank you, and Desmond, over to you. You may speak from right there.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. As you mentioned, this is rather timely to be talking about Europe, just watching what's going on the political front. What I want to do is talk about, why I think that Europe is headed in a direction that could be very challenging for freedom. And my basic thesis is that what we're seeing in Europe is very poor economics, which is driving the politics, which is in turn making it difficult for the economics to be good. So I see Europe in somewhat of a political economic spiral, which to me doesn't look like it's going to lead to a good result. So what I want to do is, I thought that I would just talk factually about what's been happening in the economic front and the political front in Europe. That I'd do first. I then offer some of my views as to why this might be occurring. And then finally, I might just say a word as to where I think Europe might be heading. So let me just put up the first chart that I'd like to look at, because I think that this encapsulates how poor Europe's performance has been, since 2008. And what we've got here is the black line is the current cycle in Europe, and what we're looking at is the years since the start of the cycle, and we're looking at real GDP. So the black line is telling you that Europe is yet to recover, and I'm talking about the good parts of Europe and the bad parts of Europe. This includes Germany and the northern part of Europe. But if you take Europe overall, what you've got is Europe has basically yet to recover its pre-2008 peak. And just to get some idea of how bad that is if you look at the grey line are the Sterling bloc countries in 1929 depression that, sure, they had a deeper depression, but already after 5 years, they had regained that path and they were going at a very much higher rate of growth subsequently. And even those countries that stayed on gold, the gold bloc countries, after 8 years, they recovered. This doesn't look like it's happening to Europe. Finally, the red line is Japan. It looks like Japan had a veritable boom in the 90s in relation to what Europe is doing. If we look at this in relation to the United States, a similar kind of pattern. The United States had the crisis, but the United States, I wouldn't say that economic growth in the United States has been stellar in this cycle. It's been the slowest that we've had on record, but nonetheless, they're 10 percentage points higher than Europe. If you just translate that, we're talking about $1.6 trillion or so a year in lost output in Europe, which is pretty bad. Of course, what you've got in Europe is you've got a difference between the north and the south. This chart just gives you some idea of it, that the dotted lines are what they thought before the crisis, what their growth trajectory was. The solid lines are what actually happened. Germany's not too bad. Germany's a little bit similar to the United States, but if you look like Spain, which is being touted as, growing really very rapidly, Spain is still something like 5% below its 2008 peak, which is pretty poor after 8 years. The next chart is really telling you the bad cases. These are cases that really could present Europe with huge difficulties down the road. I'm just thinking of, we go back as far as 1999, that you just look at Portugal, Greece, Italy. Barely, there's been no economic growth during that whole period. Italy is particularly worrying, being such a large country with $2 trillion of debt, that there's been absolutely no growth at all. Now, what's occurring in Europe is that they've had a recovery the last 18 months, but this recovery now is showing signs of fading. And what they've got is they've got unresolved problems. They've got a unemployment rate that is unacceptably high. The euro area as a whole is around about 11% unemployment. United States is now down to 5%. But you look at countries like Greece, Spain, unemployment is well over 20%. What is of particular concern, just in terms of if you think that the Eurozone debt crisis is over, you just need to take a look at the next chart, which is showing you that countries are now going into possibly a downturn with excessively high debt levels. I'm not just talking about Greece. I'm looking at Italy has got a debt level now of about 130%, Portugal the same in relation to GDP. And if you do go into a downturn, it's just going to be a matter of time before we get another debt crisis. The same thing with deflation, that Europe as a whole is now suffering from outright deflation. Core price inflation itself is down 1%. If you've got no growth and you've got deflation, it's quite a challenge to get out of your debt problem. Of course, all of this, what I've just said before, looks relatively rosy in relation to the story in Greece, which is a real problem, is that Greece's depression now looks like it's worse than that of the United States. The blue and red lines are showing making the comparison that the United States by this time in its depression had already turned up fairly sharply. Greece is still down. The IMF is forecasting with the program that Greece's output is going to decline by 2% this year, by another 1% next year. Eventually it'll stop declining. There'll be nothing much more for it to do. The next chart just puts it into perspective, that the only countries that have been worse in terms of depressions than Greece, you've had Latvia in 2008, around about 25%, the USA in 29%. So Greece is really problematic. So much for the facts on the economic side. If you look at the politics, my concern is what has been occurring is that the politics has been driven by the very poor economics. And what you're getting across Europe, certainly across the periphery, is real backlash against the elites. You're getting fragmentation of the politics. Greece would be the clearest example. This chart, just suggests that in around about 2007, the two traditional parties, New Democracy and PASOK, parties in the center in Greece, they got 70% of the vote. By the time you get to 2015, they barely got 25, 30% of the vote. Meantime, you've got an extreme left, Syriza, which is now in power, and you've got a whole bunch of other parties. It's not just Greece. We've just had an election in Portugal where the traditional party running the show, Forward Portugal, they had 52% of the vote 5 years ago. They've now got 38%. Portugal's now going to have at least 9 months of a political crisis. But I'm thinking about Spain's going to have an election that a system that used to be a two-party system now becomes a four-party system. Doesn't bode well for how government is going to be. And then the one that is really of concern is Italy, where you've got all the parties in opposition are saying they want to be out of the euro. They don't want more to do with austerity. So it doesn't take much. If we get another downturn, this could really get very ugly. Now, many reasons can be put forward, for Europe's poor economic performance. Just from a structural point of view, they've got overly rigid labor markets. They're over-regulated. They're not friendly towards business. They've got very high tax and spending levels. Those are things that are going to impede Europe getting onto a rapid growth path. It's got very poor demographics, aging population. I don't want to get into the migration issue. That's another kettle of fish. But I'd suggest that one of Europe's really big problems is, certainly in the Eurozone, is they got themselves into a currency arrangement that made absolutely no sense. Americans were warning about this before the euro was launched. Europe simply doesn't have the conditions for a monetary union. and they got the cart before the horse. They should have got the politics right, and then they should have got into that monetary union. So I think that they're still going to struggle dealing with the euro going forward. Finally, just let me say once again that where I think we're going is I think that the euro crisis is very far from being over. It's got structural, economic, and political problems. And now what it looks to me like with what's going on in China and the emerging market economies, it looks clear that we're going into another slowdown. So I would see the politics and the economics feeding off one another going forward. Of course, what we'll have is we'll have the ECB, the European Central Bank, doing more or less what the Fed was doing in the United States, masking these problems by having another round of quantitative easing. But I think that can kick the can down only so much down the road. Places that I'm really concerned about, where I think that there'd be trigger points for the Eurozone crisis coming back, are, of course, Greece. It's not going to have the political will to stick with the program that they've just signed with the IMF. It doesn't make sense to do more budget austerity when you're right in the depths of a depression and have the economy falling, and you get then the political backlash. Shouldn't surprise, but Portugal and Italy, to me, look pretty vulnerable too. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to speak here at the Heritage Foundation. I would start praising this study that you have now done for more than 20 years. I think that this is very important, that we have a good measurement of economic freedom. I also appreciate that there are competing studies, that the Fraser Institute, allied with the Cato Institute, does its study, and you do yours, because competition is good. And you both improve looking at one another. And this means that we have now good assessment of structural reforms and economic freedom, also what the World Bank does, and Transparency International and others. This greatly helps so that structural reform matters. Otherwise, it's very easy that we just get stuck discussing a macroeconomic, which is not so important for growth until you get it really wrong. As Helle mentioned here, initially, I've basically been dealing with economic policy in Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. But given how messy Europe now looks, I normally look up on what looks messy and not what looks good. We're currently writing a book on how Europe can grow again, together with Simeon Yankov, former Minister of Finance of Bulgaria. So this is very much the framework, and we are looking there upon all the 28 countries of the European Union. The basic message here is stagnation, economic stagnation, and also stagnation in economic reform. I counted both your report and the Fraser Institute report on economic freedom in the world. Show that there has been an improvement in economic freedom of 2% in the last 14 years. And that's not good.
40 years.
14.
14.
So since 2000, essentially the world has not reformed on average. While lots were done in the 1980s and the 1990s, which both indexes show. So why haven't we seen much of structural reform in the last 15 years? Well, because things were too good. 2003 to 2007, these 5 years, according to the IMF, with purchasing power parity assessment, the world had an average growth of almost 5% a year. The world had never grown so much. And now you see all these curves showing that this is where we should get in order to get back to the growth potential. These were exceptional years for almost the whole world. And therefore, we should not expect to come back to it. On the contrary, we should think of it in terms, how can we do good? And that should be the thought. Why was it so good during this decade from 2000 to 2008? Well, it was a massive commodity boom for the emerging economies, and it was a massive credit boom for the whole world. And credit booms are long; they last for a decade or more, but they end. And then you have a decade of low growth. Admittedly, also it can be of a low inflation. But now this is over. So what do we do in this situation? Well, what we certainly should not do is what has been done, to try to pump up public expenditures. So if you look upon Europe, what Europe has done, Desmond very elegantly showed the growth rates. In terms of public expenditure, the public expenditure has increased to 3% of GDP. And what is Europe's biggest problem? Why is Europe underperforming? Well, because public expenditure in Europe, Western Europe I should say, is 10% of GDP, higher than the average for the US, Canada and Japan. So what is this 10% of GDP spent on? Only on one thing, social transfers. So, and where are the taxes paid? On labor. So the European workers pay far too high taxes on their labor in order to give the money back to themselves in social transfers. Doesn't make much sense. And this sharply reduces the economic growth. This is the fundamental problem in Europe. If you look upon the other indicators here, your index rightly puts Europe high in most regards, but it's the public expenditures that is the big problem in general. So why did we end up here? Well, I think that Greece, that Desmond nicely talked about, is a good illustration to it. During 5 years, the European Union has discussed one thing: how not to solve the Greek crisis. And therefore, they have managed not to solve it. My view is that you can do many things, but you have to do something. Hank Paulson here in the fall of 2008, I thought that he was awful, making one decision after the other without any consistent principles. In hindsight, I think that he did wonderfully, because he did something. If you have a crisis, you solve it. Well, the attitude of the European Union is that if you have a crisis, you have a meeting in order to have another meeting. So we have now just seen that after having somehow solved the Greek crisis, the European Union is now having one meeting after the other on how not to do anything about the refugee crisis, which will probably have equally or even worse results. So, and to the extent that the European Union discussed something about Greece, of course they also discussed structural reforms, but it was a heavy focus on macroeconomics, while Greece's problems are structural. And that was very much put in the background, very much because of not very beneficial Greek governments. And what should have been done instead? Well, the good thing is that we have, I would argue in Europe, 4 countries that have done the right things. The 3 Baltic countries plus Ireland. What did they do? They undertook, they pursued proper fiscal stabilization rather than trying to pump up their public expenditure so that they would go bust, as Greece did. And when you do that, you can also do structural reforms. You have a focus on it. My favorite example is in the first year of crisis, in 2009, Latvia did a fiscal adjustment of about 9% of GDP. Greece in 2010, when everybody were talking about how the Greeks were suffering, made a fiscal adjustment of 2%. And therefore, Greece has continued having economic decline for 60 years because financial confidence was never re-established, while Latvia, with a firm stabilization policy, managed to restore confidence in the economy in half a year, and in 2 years restore economic growth. This is the simple truth, and does not reach all this discussion that is very much dominated by Paul Krugman, that we always have to stimulate the economy. There's simply no empirical evidence of this being useful at all. And the numbers are quite extraordinary. So Latvia has fully recovered after having suffered from a severe liquidity squeeze in 2008. And Greece is just falling and falling. So Desmond talked a lot about Southern Europe. What is wrong with Southern Europe structure? The first thing that is wrong is education. Portugal has only 42% of the labor force has completed high school. If you have a labor force with an education as a third world country, you would expect that you have salaries as a third world country. The problem, which Desmond showed, is that they have too high salaries, given their productivity level. And the second problem is little and poor higher education. Southern Europe has least high education, and they have poor quality of higher education also. The second problem is, as we all know, poor enterprise environment. The third problem, overregulated labor markets. And the fourth problem is high taxes and high public expenditures. Greece has persistently had public expenditures over 50%. The Nordic countries can get away with it because they are highly deregulated and generally well run. But if you have poor governance and very high public expenditures, you would not expect to get economic growth. So if we had forgotten about macro and looked upon these indicators of the structural situation and what we all know gives economic growth, then we would have seen the picture clearer. And optimistic as I am, I think that now we can hope for this. And there are also good examples of what is happening in Europe. We are seeing the East Europeans are pushing low taxes. The standard tax system is now low and equal, flat corporate and income taxes. The corporate profit tax in Europe in the last 25 years has fallen from 48% to currently 26%. The US has 39% if you include state taxes. So tax competition works in Europe. And what we need is more of the markets, and that we are likely to get. And I see now with the current refugee crisis, what is the reaction? People want to have free labor markets so that people can work rather than having this massive unemployment, and lower social expenditures because people are not so keen on spending money on strangers as on their neighbors. So I think that we are seeing an opening up. And when it comes to high-tech development, you have half a dozen Northern European countries that are doing as well as the US. And we are in almost all cases seeing some countries that are doing it right. The low public expenditures you find in Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and you see the best tax system in the East. So when it comes to sophistication, Northern Europe does well. When it comes to public expenditure and tax system, Eastern Europe does well. The point is that the Europeans need to learn from themselves. And where you have a real shortcoming, that is when it comes to the high-tech development, the highest education. The worst is universities. I checked on the Shanghai list and the Times Higher Education Supplement. Over 50 best universities in the world. 30 are in the United States, 6 or 7 in Britain, and only 4 on the EU continent. That's the weakest situation, and that's where Europe really needs to improve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to start off by complimenting Desmond Lachman, because we were on a panel here about 4 years ago, I think it was, as the euro crisis was just sort of starting to roll, and Desmond was his normal cheerful self, and predicted that the steps that were just being contemplated at that point in Greece would lead to a compounding fiscal, economic, and political crisis, whereby bad economic measures would drive bad politics, leading to the ongoing collapse, as he predicted then, of the Greek political system. So I've rarely encountered a prediction that came true with more devastating effect than that one from Desmond. So I encourage everyone to pay attention to his remarks today, because he has a pretty good track record, at least in this room. Unlike the other two panelists, I'm a historian by training, so I'm going to do what historians like to do, which is to talk about the future, because it's much easier than talking about the past. I was very struck by an interview that a speech that Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, gave last week, in which he said, among other things, that economically we see the end of Europe's glorious years compared to what others are doing. Mr. Juncker presented this as a new insight. In fact, it's anything but a particularly new insight. Really, Europe's economically glorious years probably ended in the early 1970s, and concerns about subpar European or EU growth, I don't want to use those two terms as precisely synonyms, have been a near constant for the last 20 years or so. It's interesting to look back quickly at the way that the EU has responded to these concerns. 15 years ago, the EU advanced its Lisbon strategy, which sought to make the EU, quote, the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion. I think we can safely say that those aims were not achieved. We now have the Europe 2020 strategy proposed by the Commission in March 2010, which aims to promote, quote, smart, sustainable, inclusive growth. Well, at least that's a little shorter than the previous set of aims, but it's the same thing all over again, and I predict that the European Union will fail just as badly with the 2020 strategy as it did with the Lisbon strategy. Now, my fellow panelists are far better to explain these failures than I am, being a historian, but most economists who have studied the European Union tend to come to broadly similar conclusions. There is a large regulatory state, there is very high social spending, there is a social and a political preference for stability over change, all of which make it hard for the EU to be even as dynamic as the United States is, and we, of course, are not as dynamic as I believe that we could and should be. It's certainly not true, as Anders has pointed out, that everything in the EU or Europe as a whole is terrible. There are examples like the Baltic states that demonstrate that things in Europe are not hopeless. Europe can grow if it wants to grow. The question is, does it have the political and the economic willpower to do the things that are necessary? But the broader point in the context of today's discussion of economic freedom is simply this. Productivity growth is central to economic growth, and economic freedom is central to productivity growth. Because if you don't have economic freedom, it's very hard to allocate resources flexibly in ways that lead to economic growth over time. So what do we have to look forward to as we move ahead in Europe? Well, here's my thesis. When Europe, and when I mean Europe, I really mean the EU's institutions and the EU's leaders. When the EU has to respond to economic challenges, economic difficulties, economic issues, they will tend, I would almost say they will always respond to those challenges by political centralization, not by economic liberalization. The overriding goal of the EU, in my view, is not to promote European economic growth. It is to promote European political unity, even at the cost of European economic growth. In other words, in the EU, politics tends to drive economics, not the other way around. Economics are an excuse for taking what are fundamentally political measures. So the major EU initiative, for example, in the 2000s, after the Lisbon strategy was adopted, was the euro, a financial instrument that was intended to promote political unity. Now, other options were available. At precisely the same time, Chancellor Gerhard Schröder of Germany was pushing through important labor market reforms in Germany that play a considerable role in Germany's ongoing, broadly more satisfactory economic performance. A Europe that was genuinely eager to become more flexible and dynamic, as the Lisbon strategy called for, could have followed the German lesson, or indeed the broadly comparable lesson of the United Kingdom. Instead, in Europe, we got the euro. Now, in practice, the euro has certainly not promoted either political unity or economic growth. So what can we expect the response to be from the EU to Europe's current economic doldrums? Well, in my view, the answer is further political and economic centralization. And that is exactly what we're going to get. If you read the so-called Five Presidents report from the heads of the Commission, the Euro Summit, the Eurogroup, the ECB, and the European Parliament, the next steps that are laid out in this authoritative report are quite clear. There is going to be a three-stage process that would put EU institutions in charge of national fiscal policies. That means the EU setting taxes and spending levels across the entire EU and controlling much more by the year 2025. Now, it is possible that such control would on occasion advance economic freedom as we define it, in much the same way that the European Union, for example, prevents its member nations from imposing tariffs on intra-EU trade. But leaving aside all questions of national sovereignty and the rights of free peoples to govern themselves, the broad results of this kind of centralized control would be to further reduce the flexibility of the European economies, to force them into a policy straitjacket that is fundamentally about saving the euro by further centralizing political and economic control, and is not about promoting economic growth. It will also, by the way, make the kind of tax competition that Anders has pointed out as a positive factor much, much harder to achieve, because one of the measures that the EU will surely want to drive through will be to make tax levels equal across the European Union. A profoundly uncompetitive step. Now, the United States can do something about this. In short, in my view, it can stop cheerleading for the European Union, but it can't do very much, because ultimately decisions on these questions will be taken in the European Union, not in Washington. The United States can, however, control its own trade diplomacy. And it's on the question of trade that I'd like to close. The major agenda item on U.S.-EU relations over the next few years, it could be a few years as 2 or 3, it could be a decade or more, is going to be TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. In my view, TTIP should come with a warning label, something like contents may not be as shown on cover. TTIP is commonly described as a free trade area. Whatever TTIP is going to be, it is not going to be a free trade area, for the simple reason that we're already very close to having free trade, as you and I would understand that term, in the North Atlantic area. Indeed, if you look at the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, the world does better on trade freedom than almost any other form of economic freedom. TTIP is really something quite different. It's an effort to decide how the U.S. and the EU are going to regulate the transatlantic market, not how they can free the transatlantic market. Now, it is quite true that the existence of different kinds of regulations in the US and the EU impose burdens on businesses that seek to sell in both markets. Wouldn't deny that. But the burden of differential regulations, that is, the burden of having regulations of one form on widgets in the EU and another form of regulations in the United States, the burden of those differing regulation is not nearly as significant as the overall burden of regulation in both the United States and the European Union. In other words, the US and the EU could get rid of the burden of having different regulations by agreeing that each side of the Atlantic would be as burdensome as the other side. That would eliminate the burdensome difference in regulations, but it would leave the overall regulatory burden essentially untouched. Far from being a measure that's intended to reduce this overall regulatory burden, TTIP will in practice, and is already being defended as, a mechanism for making sure that this burden is harder to reduce. Because once regulations are made by US-EU agreement, changing them and reducing them will be even harder than it is today. I would argue that there is simply no way that TTIP can substantially increase economic freedom in the US or the EU for the simple reason the major threat to economic freedom no longer comes from measures on either side of the Atlantic that restrain transatlantic trade. Even the most optimistic assessments of TTIP's impact make it clear there's simply not enough juice in the orange, no matter how hard you squeeze it, for it to have more than a relatively marginal impact. So the question naturally arises, why is the EU making such a big deal out of its desire for TTIP? And make no mistake about it, TTIP, although a fairly minor item in the American policy mind, is a very big deal in the European policy mind and policy arena. I would argue that the EU favors TTIP for roughly the same reasons that it favored the euro, to achieve political objectives. In the case of TTIP, there are three political objectives that matter. First, the goal or the desire to achieve equality with Asia and the newly signed TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in the eyes of the United States. TTIP is, by this way of thinking, basically a form of diplomatic and economic compensation for the EU. Second, to negotiate an agreement that will serve as a lever to keep the United Kingdom inside the European Union. Basically, TTIP will become a threat that will be used against the United Kingdom. You will see people saying, in fact, you're already seeing people saying, if the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, you won't get the benefits of TTIP, so therefore don't even think about leaving. Third, a desire to export the EU's regulatory model to the United States and perhaps beyond in ways that will reduce the disparities between the EU and the rest of the world, not by lifting the EU up, but by dragging everyone else down. In short, in my view, TTIP is a bad answer to the wrong question. If we want more economic freedom in Europe, and I certainly do, the way to get it is not really to focus on trade, because trade is the most free part of the transatlantic relationship. It is to focus on all of the other barriers to economic freedom that Desmond and Anders have laid out. The overlarge, centralizing, high-spending, welfare-driven, bureaucratic state, the profound difficulties of the euro that Desmond has laid out, and the other areas that my fellow panelists have discussed. Trade is simply not highly controlled, not highly restricted enough for changes in the trade realm to make a really big difference in either the US or the EU. That wasn't true in the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, when changing trade, when moving to free trade really did make a difference. But I'm afraid it's true now. Do I think this is going to happen? Unfortunately, I'm afraid I don't share Anders' optimism, because in my view, as long as the EU continues to believe that economic problems are fundamentally opportunities to impose tighter, centralized political controls, I doubt that Europe is going to see a new birth of economic freedom. Instead, it's going to see further political centralization and further economic centralization in ways that will end up impeding economic freedom and therefore, over the long run, Europe's economic performance and its place in the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's certainly some rather dire predictions. If I could just have the privilege of asking the first question, going back to what Desmond was saying about the problem of the euro, how Europe has wedded itself to this unfortunate currency stranglehold. What is your prediction? Ted was into predictions as far as the euro is concerned. We were all of us, focused like laser beams on the euro when Greece was going through its maneuverings not so long ago. Whether it would fall out of it, whether that would cause the whole thing to implode. A quick prediction, Desmond, or all of you.
Yeah. I'm not sure that, that is really the question, that I would raise, as to whether or not the euro is going to survive. I think that what we've seen that there's a very strong commitment to try to hold the euro together. Mm-hmm. The question that I would ask is that in striving to hold it together, is that going to be damaging for Europe's long-term growth? My view is, I have agreed with the finance minister in Germany, Schäuble, as opposed to Angela Merkel, that I would have thought that it would have been healthy for the euro, for Europe, and for Greece if during the summer Greece were eased out of the euro. So that what they really need to do is to get the countries that can't be within that straitjacket. It's unreasonable to expect countries with such big structural problems like the Greeces and the Portugals and the Italys to be competing with a powerhouse like Germany, because what you're getting is you just get Germany running up these huge current account surpluses, these other countries languishing. I think that is a recipe for disaster. So I'm expecting the euro crisis to come back. I'm expecting people to begin talking again about Brexit, about Portugal exiting, and so on, certainly the next couple of years. But I think the more important question is, what does this do for European growth? And my fear is that Europe is going to be stuck with this really poor growth performance. And to a large degree, it's because they're stuck in a currency arrangement. They didn't play by the rules of that currency arrangement. So now there's no way that this can work properly. They allowed too big imbalances to develop.
Yes. Anders, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I have a rather different view. First of all, I think that the euro will hold, and how do you improve it? By imposing the rules. The development within the European Union now for the last several years has been to strengthen the rules, and I think that this will happen. And we are now seeing that there's a gradual move towards structural reform in the discussion. And rather than the euro now, I think that it's the Schengen, the visa freedom within Europe that is in danger, because Europe can't manage this refugee crisis. So I'm Swedish, and Sweden is probably getting this year 2% of its population, up to 200,000 refugees. 180,000 is the latest in the country with 10 million people, where already 1/4 of the population was born abroad. So this is, and Sweden does not have the capacity to integrate so many people. There are lots of ghettos in Sweden, in particular around the big cities, but now increasingly depopulated company towns. So Europe needs to get some sense of managing it. It's a big topic. It's outside our current agenda, but this is the old dominant theme. And the two big recipients now is first Sweden in terms of proportions, Germany in terms of numbers, and naturally the refugees prefer to go to countries that have a rather mixed population already. and that are the richer ones. So to have quotas for the East European countries is quite unrealistic, given that the levels of economic development within Europe is quite different.
Yes.
I wonder if I could ask Anders a basic question is, over the past 6-7 years, we didn't get structural reform in Europe with political conditions that were a lot more favorable than today. Now we've just seen, just to take an example, the Portuguese election, where you've got the party in power gets only 38% of the vote as opposed to the 52% it got in the previous election. 62% of the population are voting for parties that are against the euro, against the structural reform or more fiscal austerity. Why, under those conditions, if they didn't do the structural reform before, why, with the politics deteriorating, and this is not just Portugal, it's Greece, it's Italy, it's Spain, why would one expect there to be a move towards structural reform now?
I don't agree on any point. The numbers are not quite right, but I don't remember them. The Socialist Party in Portugal is very pro-euro. So you don't have a big majority against reform in Portugal. But more generally, you get structural reform when you have crisis. The problem with Europe is that the crisis has not been felt. The standard of living has not been falling. Normally you get serious economic reform when you have to do it, not when the conditions are wrong. This is the fundamental issue in the political economy.
Well, I just don't understand if unemployment has risen to the level it's done in Europe, it's more or less doubled. If incomes have stagnated for 8 years, if this would really be satisfying your condition for a crisis to occur, that living standards in Europe have actually stagnated over the last 8 years. You didn't get reform. What you're getting in Europe, at least in my view, is you're getting a backlash that what's occurring is because of this failure, the policies being proposed by the European elite are losing credibility. And what you're getting is a fragmentation of politics. People are looking to alternative solutions, either on the right, the Marine Le Pens who are riding really very high in France, or on the left, the people on the left, the Podemoses, the Syrizas, and so on. You're getting a break away from anything other than the kind of policies that one's wanting to do in terms of structural reform and austerity.
If you don't mind, I think we'd let Ted join the discussion.
Well, no. I mean, this is fascinating. I was just going to say before Desmond made his last comment that we've been broadly sort of enthusiastic about the Baltics, Eastern Europe, Germany certainly, and broadly critical about the Mediterranean countries. But the one country we haven't really mentioned here is France. And France is more significant than any of those countries except for Germany, obviously. And it's conceivable, entirely conceivable, to think of a European Union or a euro without Greece, which is really not a significant political or economic player. It's extremely hard to think of a euro or a European Union without France. And yet the French political scene isn't as dire as Greece or maybe even as Portugal, but it's hardly calm. And you see precisely the same sort of tensions in France that Desmond has pointed to, in my view, correctly, in Portugal and Greece and Italy. Maybe not quite as far along. But surely, the dog that hasn't yet barked in the European Union is France.
No, there are two dogs that I'd be very concerned about. One is France, but I'd be a lot more concerned about Italy, where that is certainly the case that all the parties other than Renzi's party are wanting out of the euro. They don't want to go the path that Italy has gone. So it's just a question, you go into the next recession, we get into that problem. I'd say France as well. Just the fact that Marine Le Pen is riding as high in the polls as she has, it's already a scary prospect to think that Marine Le Pen could be in the second round in the next presidential election. That is hardly amount for encouragement. Why I'm particularly concerned about Italy is that Italy's got a public debt to GDP ratio that's 130%. It's a country that has shown zero growth, practically zero growth, over a 15-year period. It's just a question. The only thing that's holding Italy together on the debt side is that the fact that the ECB is buying the bonds. But that's a party that can't last forever. That is really skating on thin ice, in my view.
Okay, well, let's have one more comment on this, and then we'll let the audience ask the questions.
Well, let me respond to this. First of all, the left is virtually dead in Europe. What has happened in Greece is that Syriza has now become what PASOK was. A center-left party rather than an extreme party. I looked up on the extreme parties, both on the left and the right in Greece got 16%. The communist, protesters from Syriza plus a New Dawn. So if this is the worst case, then we are in pretty good shape. Podemos is not getting very far. The British Labour Party has now been taken over by the very extreme left, which just means that the British Labour Party we can forget about until they change leadership, as was the case with Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock ran the party. We've been there before. If a party wants to make itself irrelevant, so much for them. The big thing is that we have not seen very extreme parties coming to the fore in Europe, and that the centre pretty much holds. The most striking thing is that the extreme left has lost out. You don't see communist parties that are communist parties any longer, only odd left remnants. With regard to crisis, Desmond, stagnation is not crisis. What we have seen is stagnation. And the problem is that there has not been a crisis. A crisis is when you see GDP fall by 5-10%, as was the case in Sweden and Finland in the early 90s. Then you get real reforms, or more, as we saw in the Baltic countries. Then we got real reform. It's Greece that has had, on the one hand, far too much money coming from the European Union. On the other hand, a big decline in GDP. But if you get so much money for your decline, perhaps you don't protest worse than the Greeks have done. So the politics in that sense is not worrisome. What is worrisome is that we are not seeing the strong reform discussion. So I think it's very much an intellectual shortfall. And of course, coming back to what Ted said here in your discussion, it is a problem that all the ministers of finance in Europe, they sit one day a week and really 2 days, a month, sit together and discuss EU matters rather than being at home dealing with their own structural reforms, because the structural reforms are by and large national. Yeah. I'm not worried about this five presidents report discussing to harmonize taxation in the future. It won't happen. So the issue is more how, if they will harmonize auditing reports and the tax basis, if that will be harmonized. And on TTIP, what Europe really needs out of it, it's service trade. Because the service directive that was adopted in 2009 has not been implemented. And TTIP could do an enormous thing, because service is 70% of trade, and it's highly protectionist in Europe. Another is digital trade, which is completely national in Europe. If you have a Netflix subscription in one European country, you have it only in one European country. If you go to a hotel in another country, you need another Netflix subscription. And also, of course, the labor market. And these things have to be eased up, and TTIP could help. So this is one reason why many Europeans are very much in favor of TTIP.
Let me just sort of respond to that briefly, and
Okay.
then maybe we'll take a question if we ever get around to it. On the question of sort of the future direction of the EU, you may of course be right that the Five Presidents report will go nowhere, but I am unwilling to write off high-level political interventions from EU institutions quite as easily as that. The euro, as I think most economists would now agree, was not a sensible measure to introduce, at least in the form and at the time it was introduced, and yet it was done anyhow. So I think we should be a little bit more cautious when we look at sort of big EU projected initiatives that are not, by a conventional sense, economically rational, and say, well, they won't happen, because as a matter of practice, the EU has on occasionally done these things with rather poor outcomes. So I guess we'll have to wait and see, but I'm a little less willing to write it off. On the services question, I agree. Services are obviously an enormous part of the overall gains from trade and the economies writ large. Absolutely. Nonetheless, every study of the potential gains of TTIP shows projected gains total of about 100 billion euros after 15 years. And that includes all the service changes. So I'm not denying that if you take the best possible case that there are some gains. Yeah, there are definitely some gains at the best possible case. But when you read commentators on TTIP, you will catch them saying things like TTIP is going to fundamentally transform the European economy, it's going to substantially raise European growth prospects. I've not seen a credible study that shows that there's enough juice in the orange for TTIP to achieve that. At best, it is relatively marginal, and I would argue that the amount of political emphasis being put on trade is ultimately at the expense of economic and structural reforms where gains are potential gains at least, are much higher, but which are going by the wayside for lack of political will.
Okay, well, let's see. We have a question down here in the front, and please identify yourself by name and affiliation. So we have some viewers on the internet who would like to participate. So,
Warren Coates, retired from the International Monetary Fund. First of all, thank you all very much. It's fascinating to see the world through the eyes of an optimist and a pessimist. The EU has many, many problems. The euro has many problems, but putting it in historical context, Europe was at war most of its history. For the last 60 years, there's been peace. The euro is often characterized as second best to a gold standard. It is a gold standard for individual members, which is why the vast majority of Greeks still want to keep the euro, because they remember what it was like having their own undisciplined currency. So given that we can go in the direction of sort of dismantling the mess and going back to more national relationships, or we can address the problems with the mess and make it stronger and work better. For that direction, what would you each propose to make the EU a better and more perfect union?
Yeah. Well,
Optimist first.
No, I think you could come up with a whole lot of ideas that could make the euro work a lot better, but one really has to look at this. One's got to look at it from a political point of view. So it's very easy for me to say that if Germany would buy into the idea of euro bonds, or if they'd buy into the idea of a fiscal union, or buy into the idea, give up, take on a lot of the costs, then the problem could very readily be solved. But then what you're really doing is you're abstracting from the politics of it, is that the German population is displaying stronger and stronger signs of bailout fatigue. They just really don't want to pony up the money the whole time. They're looking at this as a bottomless pit that one German put it to me that a horror with an end is better than, should I say, an end with horror is better than a horror without an end. And that the Germans are seeing this as a horror without an end. So, one can come up with many ways in which, that if I said that the Germans were more willing to put up the money, and if all of these countries would do all of these structural reforms and they'd suddenly grow, then you wouldn't have a problem. But then, what you're doing is you're assuming away the problem. The truth of the matter is that there's strong resistance in many of these countries to adopt these structural reforms or to adopt the fiscal authority. And I don't share Anders' view. Maybe it's because I worked with countries like Argentina, while I was at the International Monetary Fund. The worse things became, the more convoluted the system became, the more that I didn't see all of a sudden a reform occurring. So I think one's really got to look at it from a political vantage point, and that's where I'd have be fairly pessimistic about Europe's problems being solved.
Yes, Anders, do you want to?
Yeah, what I think that the European Union first of all should do is what it's supposed to do from the beginning: trade. And here it's not. I mentioned the service market where it has failed, digital market where it is now starting discussing, the energy market where it has not managed to defeat the big European energy companies that are acting in consort with Gazprom in order to avoid energy markets from developing. The energy union is now one of the big battlefronts within the European Union. This is what the EU should really do. Then standards is what the European Union has delivered in a lot of regards, and then the EU should facilitate competition, which it does not really see as its role, and the EU should clarify what it does not do, because the standard discussion in each European country is that Brussels forces us to do so and so, which is not true in case of the case. So the European politicians blame Brussels, which of course makes Brussels less popular, but the politicians think that they can get away with it, and therefore they don't do things. We see in crisis people realize that Brussels doesn't do it, and then national politics gets a new life. I strongly regret that the European Commission now probably has its weakest leadership ever. You hardly hear from Jean-Claude Juncker. What Ted mentioned here, it was one of his few public statements. He's simply absent. Federica Mogherini keeps a very, very low profile if she's given any room at all. And Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council, is also keeping a very low profile. So we've never had such low profile from the three top people in the European Commission. And if you don't have leadership, then the European Commission can't do much other than be blamed. And why are these people appointed? Because the big countries want to have a weak commission, in particular Germany, who now has, to a considerable extent, nationalized the European politics. We see it particularly with regard to Ukraine, but also with regard to many other questions. France is weaker than ever, but supports Germany in order to have a place at the table for two. Italy is pretty much out of it. The UK is pretty much out because the only thing that the UK seems to discuss is whether it should be part of the European Union or not.
Yes,
I don't agree with Anders on some of those points, but I certainly agree with his comment on Germany. And it's ironic that the U.S. has spent a very long time, really since the late 40s, early 1950s, supporting European integration on the grounds that the development of European political and economic institutions was a way to constrain Germany as a matter of practice, it's ended up becoming a way to empower Germany because of Germany's better economic policies and therefore its outsized role within European institutions. I don't want to expand on this greatly, but just to the gentleman's point, one of the useful features about wars between European nations, provided that they were limited, was that they disciplined state institutions to perform better and be more competent. Because the risk of fighting a war and having an incompetent state was that you lost. And Adam Smith actually has a wonderful discussion of this in The Wealth of Nations. He argues that the cycle of European wars created and then drove the development of competent, modern, efficient, tax-collecting, not excessively bureaucratic state apparatuses so that the state wouldn't lose too many wars. And that is not a call for the return of warfare to the European continent, but it is a historical point that the removal of the stimulus of limited war leaves you with the problem that the only way to move the system is not by someone else threatening you, that is a foreign power, it's through the conventional political process. And obviously I'm a huge supporter of that, but we should be aware of the historical downside of having to rely on internally directed reform only. Europe never did better economically and politically than it did in the 19th century when it spent all the time fighting itself. Its decline came after 1945 when it decided to stop.
Interesting point. Never put that one before its head. Okay, we have some more questions here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually,
Well, if I could, if you have a question, I think we would appreciate it.
no,
If
actually,
it's a-
I want to
If it's more
compliment.
in nature of a statement, I would like to refer to perhaps after the event here.
No, I want to compliment this.
Yes, okay.
That is better to. Actually, I want to compliment it that we found in Europe, Western, that is Portugal or Italy, they are pro-socialist thinker, and some is capitalistic thinker. Another is democratic political between economist and politician. There is a conflict because world is gradually getting democratic, but economics remain capitalistic. This is the contradiction because state runs on institutions. The basic limitation of the economics is still we have no theory of capital distribution. But all crises generated from capital. Marx revolt against the Roman economics. Later on, socialists fall, but presently the politicians, they fight for democracy. But economics is still
Sir,
remain.
can I ask can you pose a question
Yeah, we would
or
like a
else
question.
give the microphone to someone else, please?
So my question is, do you think this European crisis is generated from absence of capital distribution theory?
Thank you. Yeah, so whether the crisis is directed from the absence of capitalistic activity, was that the question? I think we have all been
Yeah.
advocating capitalistic activity, haven't we?
Well, I mean, if you're looking for someone to say there should be more capitalistic activity, you probably come to the right building in Washington D.C. So that's, I think probably all of us would agree with that. I don't see Europe. I'll yield to my other panelists on this. I don't see Europe as an anti-capitalist continent. Anders is quite right to point out that communist parties have not done particularly well. I think I would argue that he's probably expanded the definition of what is a mainstream party a little further than I would perhaps have done. But I don't see Europe's problem as being anti-capitalist in the sense that, let's say, Eastern Germany or North Korea or the Soviet Union were or even anti-capitalist in the way that a number of third world countries are, which is anti-capitalist in the sense that the social and political institutions are so weak that any sort of organized market is difficult or impossible to carry out. I see Europe's disease as being fundamentally perhaps a result of the achievements of capitalism. Only a continent as rich as Europe could, thanks to capitalism, could afford to indulge in so many economic fallacies and political malfunctions as Europe manages to do. If you're trying to get along in the world, if you haven't already risen close to the top of the system, why would you possibly take all of these counterproductive steps? That doesn't mean I defend them, obviously. I'm more on the pessimistic side of the panel. But these are in some ways diseases of capitalism, or at least permitted by capitalism.
Yeah. But I know there was a question over here. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Danielle. I'm with American University, and my question is, what are or will be the political or the economic effects of the Russian economy collapse on the EU and Eastern Europe in consideration with the Baltics and trade?
Yes.
Easy question. Minimal effects. We have already now seen that Russia's GDP fallen from $2.1 trillion last year to $1.2 trillion. And Russia's imports this year are falling by about 40%. What does that matter? Very little. So if you take the most important country in trade with Russia, Germany, last year 2.7% of Germany's exports went to Russia. This year 1.7%. So it's so little that it doesn't really matter. And how does that impact Germany's exports overall? They are increasing by about 6%. So it's really quite insignificant. The main impact is that Gazprom's gas will fall to almost half the price before, because gas with a bit delay follows the oil price. And Russia's exports this year are falling by about 30%, or perhaps 1/3, depending a bit on where the oil price. Oil and gas are 2/3 of Russia's exports. So I actually wrote an article about this in a German magazine a week ago, so that's why I have the numbers on top of my head. But it was the head of the German Ostausschuss, the business organization for trading with Eastern Europe, who complained that Germany was suffering from the Western sanctions against Russia. So I explained that was not at all the case. Germany is suffering from the oil price falling, and therefore the Russian GDP at current exchange rate is falling since they have a floating exchange rate.
Okay. Question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Sebastian Dudens. I live in Germany, so maybe I can add some first-hand experience on that topic. For us in Germany, and I think in the whole Europe, one of the major tasks is to become competitive in the digital world, and Anders Aslund touched briefly upon that. We feel that we are lagging behind the rest of the world, above all the United States. The Germans and the Europeans love the internet, but the services we use are above all here from the United States. So what happens, European companies are trying to become more competitive, and sometimes it even works. And European politicians are trying to, set a new framework in order to support this this task. And they're trying to create a digital single market. You mentioned it already, which would probably make it easier for German and all European companies to go beyond your borders, and including American companies to go to Europe, because you have to comply with one law and not with 28 different laws. And my question is, what do you think of Europe's competitiveness in the digital world? How will it develop in the coming years?
Thank you very much for this question. This is something that I'm sort of digging into. I think this is Europe's greatest weakness. And you have various elements. I touched upon bad universities. That Europe has many decent universities, but few top universities. So the only German university that makes it to this list is the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. And then you have research and development. Many countries in Europe, including Germany, spend about 3% of GDP on research and development, and it's as the US does. And it's the same proportions, 2/3 private and 1/3 public, approximately as in the US. But it's the next step that is difficult to get the innovative environment, the high-tech hubs. It was one of these, it was McKinsey that published a few years ago a study showing that the 30 top high-tech hubs in the world existed in the US. And none of them was in Europe. So it's the ecosystem of a high-tech development that is missing in Europe. And part of it is decentralization, not wanting to have a concentration, of not wanting to have elite universities, and very much how money is being spread. 40% of venture capital in Europe is poisoned by public money. And if you have public money in something like venture capital, then you don't have a sheer risk-taking that you need. You don't have a long-termism that is needed. But there are surely other elements also, but a purely technical side is there. But this is really one of the big questions, why Europe is lagging behind. It's also people are pointing to that it's bad to fail in Europe. In Sweden, you don't go through a personal bankruptcy. It essentially doesn't exist. So if you are in the situation of a personal bankruptcy, there's only one thing to do: take your life. That's it. So this is unfortunately how it happens. So there are many things that need to change, and I think this is really the biggest question for the European countries that are doing well, how to keep up. We see that there are successes like Skype in Estonia, but 15 years ago we had Nokia and Ericsson ruling the roost when it comes to mobile phones. Now it's difficult to find these outstanding examples. It's Apple, Google, and Amazon that rule the high-tech world.
I just have two sort of quick comments on that. The first is that when you take a look at the reaction of EU institutions to the current dominance, I don't think it's necessarily forever, in fact it's almost certainly not forever, of US-founded firms on the internet, the EU's reaction is to engage its competition policy and start filing monopoly cases. That doesn't immediately strike me as the reaction of an institution that's really eager on digital competitiveness. It strikes me as a fundamentally defensive and legalistic reaction, which I think is not going to be successful in the long run. And then even more broadly than that, so much of what Europe does is pro-stability, which is great in a lot of ways. The European social welfare systems are very comfortable. The whole effort to preserve the euro is about preserving stability. I mean, I see a lot of reasons for that, given European history and sort of personal considerations. I don't know the answer to this, but I just ask the question: is that the attitude and the approach of a place that is going to develop lots of extremely disruptive businesses, which by their nature are going to put large numbers of people out of work and employ large numbers of other people, but which are going to be agents of social and cultural change. It doesn't seem to me that that those two attitudes are comparable.
Can I just add here?
Final comments?
On this, that indeed too great socialization of risk. This is the fundamental problem. But having said that, I checked the Swedish billionaires the other day and found that there are 20 Swedish dollar billionaires. And then I looked up on their, which is not bad, and then I looked up on the companies, and it turned out that only one of them was a company that existed before World War II. So that this has been created after World War II, so it shouldn't be counted out altogether.
How many of them were IKEA?
One.
Desmond, do you have any final words to impart?
Not really. Just going back to the question asked on Russia. I agree with Anders that Russia in itself doesn't pose a problem, but what Russia is suffering from is it's suffering from very low international commodity prices that are affecting many countries, and we've now got the emerging market economies that if you look at them as a group. They're accounting for something like 40% of global GDP. This was the main source of the engine of growth in the past 10 years. That has totally shut down. I'm thinking not simply of Russia, but places like Brazil, all of the oil producers, Turkey, Indonesia, South Africa. When you add it all up, that is very problematic. For the global economy, it's also going to be very problematic for Europe.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our panelists.